we're back again, and it's the end of round 4. I'm again joined by Carlo, and we're going to be looking at the predictions for round 5. Now, Carl Curson hasn't actually put the predictions out yet. We're waiting to fill those in, so I will fill those in once they're out. But we're looking at 2 matchups today, and we're also going to look at predicting the final. We'll start with obviously a roundup so far, though, of all the stats that we've collected so far, a couple of different things that we've looked at. And we'll start ourselves off with units. So units, I've marked them in yellow, as you can see here. We've got Stormcrow Mercenaries. If you take out their mirror matchups, which there actually haven't been any yet, 71% win rate. What do you think of that, Carlo?
I think we've seen them up there all the way through. What's getting interesting about this is that it seems to be kind of game independent, game mode independent. They seem to just be a good pick throughout. And also that as a neutral unit, they're appearing in a lot of armies, and yet they are getting use all over the place and winning with a high rate. I think it says something about the game in general when this unit costs 5 points, but because of its reduced cost in the attachment, a lot of people consider them to be effectively the cheapest combat unit in the game at 4 points outside of conscripts and the Free Folk Raiders. And so that basically what is the cheapest unit in the game for most factions, available to most factions, is one of the highest performing. Says that really what we're looking at is that people value high activation count over quality units in a lot of places.
Yeah, definitely. Now, it is probably worth mentioning at this point that a very common combo with the Stormcrow Mercenaries is, of course, with Stark. I think you see him quite a lot with Rickon, making effectively the dog free, and Brandon Hodor reducing that to 1 point, which is a very effective attachment for 1 point. So it is definitely true to say that the Stormcrow Mercenaries appear in Starks, but they're appearing in other lists as well, and they're generally speaking, as you say, doing very well from a range of lists, including Baratheons. So yeah, what about Stark Outriders then? Is the next one down?
I think Stark Outriders are interesting that they've managed to get through Feast for Crows, where they might have been considered slightly less useful, and yet still are performing at that 70% win rate. We're now talking about 4 game modes, 30 games where they haven't been in mirrors, and yet they win 70% of the time. You know, we see that get pushed towards 66% when you include the mirrors because someone has to have lost.
Yeah.
And so that's the most times that Outriders lose, or when they have to play into other Stark Outriders. You could say that this is an effect of Starks being strong, but it's not, because Starks only have a 55% win rate and the Outriders have a 70% win rate. So this is that good Stark lists are running them and good Stark players are running them.
Yes. Yeah, definitely agree. So, moving down towards the bottom of the list, unfortunately, you can see I've got a lot of things here. Now, I've highlighted the Targaryens here. You can see win rates are abysmal. But, you know, what I did want to say here is that I don't think this is very true of the unit's capability. Again, low games played, low number of players playing Targaryens, and the Targaryens at the moment have got a sub 20% win rate in the tournament. I think they've played something akin to just over 10 games, and I think they've got 3 wins. I think they've got like 12 games, 3 wins. It's really bad.
Yeah.
So this is not a surprise, and it's just a function of the faction so far. So, you know, they look bad, but they're not as bad as people think. However, is a popular one to talk about because obviously the massive changes to the Flayed Men, people generally considered them worse in the community. 33% win rate over 21 games for the Flayed Men, and this is not just from Targaryen lists, this is actually predominantly Baratheons or other lists taking them. What do you think about that?
I think it's interesting that basically no lists up towards the top of the standings see the flayed men in them.
No.
They are being used when they are being used as a filler because a faction doesn't really have another good choice
Hmm.
because they are generally considered not a great choice themselves. Really, basically, Lannisters have Knights of Castle Rock who are performing well.
Hmm.
Starks have got the Tully Cavaliers, which are just better, or the Stark Outriders, which are also a brilliant choice coming in significantly cheaper. If anything, I
Yeah.
might prefer to have Stark Outriders than have Flayed Men. And that's I'd probably rather pay 9 points for Stark Outriders than I'd pay 9 points for Flayed Men.
Wow.
Yeah.
Big
I
claim.
mean, maybe it's an oversight, but like, their armor's not significantly different. The Outriders are faster. Their bushwhack ability is better than the Flayed Men's panic on charge ability.
Hmm.
Really, the Flayed Men just are lackluster at the moment. So they only appear in armies that are desperate to get some heavy-ish cavalry. And I don't think they're brilliant, but I think that Zorse have a better place right now.
Yeah. All right then. Okay, so we'll move on to our NCUs then. And at the top of the list of NCUs, we've got a couple here. Courtney Penrose, 73% win rate over 11 games. No mirrors so far played. What do you
Love Courtney.
think?
Really powerful set of cards, powerful ability when used right. It's got a decent skill cap on it in terms of predicting where your opponent's going to want to put the zonal effects down. But even then, it can have a certain denial effect where you're basically going to force your opponent not to take certain zones.
Hmm.
All of that while bringing a whole element of like Lannister based control into a Baratheon list. For me, there is no better Renly side commander. So I love him. I've been playing him, and I want to get better with him. I think if you haven't taken him on the Renly side, then it's an oversight.
Okay. You see Marjorie Terrell up there as well. Again, Renly side. 67% is a very good NCU. Yeah, very strong. Um,
Her ability is okay. Her heal one is fine. It gets pushed into a higher efficiency when you either heal one or deal one wound to
yeah.
an infantry unit. So when you lack somebody to heal on the first turn, the second turn, maybe around where you just happen to literally have no wounds left to put on, you can just do a wound to an infantry unit.
Hmm.
If you took away the requirement for that to be an infantry unit, you would move this into god tier level NCU because it would be killing dogs left, right, and center. But I guess luckily, that has the stipulation of infantry only.
Hmm.
So that keeps her manageable. And all of that is an okay NCU. And then you say, plus, I have phenomenal synergy with Rose Knights, and I double my effectiveness when used on Rose Knights, which is always going to where I'm going to apply her. We're going to talk in a minute about Tycho, but basically over the course, you're always going to play 4 rounds, really. Call it 5 most games. You're going to get the effect of Tycho trickled over the game, except that the difference here is thanks to the Rose Knights, you're mostly going to pretty much double the effectiveness of that.
Yeah.
You're going to get heal 5, deal 5 over 5 rounds,
Yeah.
or at least close to. You're at least going to be, I think you're pretty much going to guarantee dealing 5. The question is, how many are you going to heal?
Yeah. Yeah. I can see that. Obviously, turn one being the swing turn there, where you don't get the heal. But yeah, yeah, I agree. I think Marjorie's very strong. So I mean, another thing we've got to mention, of course, is Walder and Varys as a little mention here. We've taken out the mirrors, as we can see here, and we're looking at a 68% win rate for Walder and a 67% win rate for Varys. This is starting, in my opinion, to move into the realms of very strong. And these are not an insignificant number of games played. 45 for Varys in non-mirrors, 25 for Walder in non-mirrors. Are there any comments you wanted to make on those? I know we've already done talk about these guys before, but
Yeah, I think so. You look at Courtney, and he has less games played, and so does Marjorie Terrell, less games played, and they're posting 73% win ratio and 67% win ratio. They're high. Um, I don't have an issue with those win rates. But when you tell me that Walder's been played 25 times and Varys has been played 45 times outside of mirrors, he's actually been played 53 times total, and they have a 68 and a 67% win ratio. I care, and I think that it's too high because unfortunately, a neutral unit isn't allowed to have as high a win rate as that because you're saying that this NCU's value is so high to every single faction out there that he is not picked for a specific purpose or a specific synergy. They're picked just for their pure value, and they detract from the amount of variability we see in the game, and they detract from the number of picks we see elsewhere. I'm okay with Courtney and Marjorie Tyrell because they're not only a single faction, they're also only half of one faction.
Mhm.
So they represent a very specific synergy. And okay, everybody's leaning quite heavily into that. If you're playing on that side right now, you are playing Rose Knights. But everybody and his dog, or not, their dogs, shall we say. Everybody and their dog is playing Varys, and too many people are running Walder. And just winning with them just because they have them.
We did mention Mance Raider at 62% win rate for Free Folk, which doesn't sound that oppressive. It doesn't sound that strong. 13 games played. You know, he's up there with the likes of Courtney and Marjorie. The interesting thing we were to talk about here, though, is that Free Folk are the only faction outside of Targaryens that post less than a 50% win rate in this tournament. And yet Mance, 62%. That's a very, very comparative percentage win rate if you look at the faction as a whole versus one NCU.
So for me, Free Folk are probably the faction that are most well defined and most strongly into the 3 NCU camp because of how they still allow themselves a ton of list building options, even once they've spent 9, 10, 11 points on NCUs.
Mm-hmm.
And in amongst that, I think that Mance is a very strong pick and will appear in that 3 NCU combo most of the time. What surprised me is that we've seen a lot of 2 NCU lists in the tournament for the Free Folk. And I think that that is not something that I would have expected and something that I don't believe is really top tier Free Folk lists, basically. But I think those that are running Mance and are doing well with Mance are more in that 3 NCU camp, and they're seeing the benefits of it.
Yeah. Okay then. So we'll leave Mance there and talk about other things, and we'll go down to the bottom of the NCU list. We said we'd talk about Tycho. Here he is. Now, I'll preface this with something very important. Now, most people might be, saying Targaryens, as we saw before, Targaryens low win rate. Tycho, oh well, he just appears in a lot of Targaryen lists. He doesn't. I think of the Targaryen lists, of the appearances of which he makes 15, I think he only appears in 2 Targaryen lists. These are genuine statistics from Tycho at 29% win rate over 24 games across the board. He's bad. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say. I mean, his design is not bad. Healing 5 wounds, like I say, is probably on par with what you expect Marjorie to achieve throughout a game, and yet she wins. He even has the flexibility of allowing it to be at the start of any turn. This allows kind of a certain amount of reactionary play to kind of explosive plays that you might not have expected. He seems in design strong. I think the thing is that he just doesn't synergize with anything. Like there are better 4-point choices inside of players' factions, which just they complete the way your faction plays,
Hmm.
and Tycho doesn't.
No, no. So I think it is as simple as that. Um, I, we see the Baratheon combo with Rose Knights. We see it with lots of things like you were saying before, but ultimately there are just better picks. Um,
We
I
see it with the Kingsguard
yeah,
now that they're allowed to be healed. These are all things like that. I say, yeah, that should work, but in reality, you're building. Maybe the problem is that you're building for failure.
hmm
You're building to have been hit and outplayed and taken a huge set of damage that you can't afford to take, and that's why you're going to heal it back.
yeah,
Maybe I'm a bit stuck because I can't point at anything about him and say that part of him is bad. He's not overcosted. 5 wounds is a good amount of wounds. It's a whole, you can gain 2 full ranks on that. Well, not full, but you could go from 1 rank at 4 models to 3 ranks at 9 models. It could be a massive swing in the like attack profile that you have to be about to put out. It can all be useful. So why doesn't he win?
yeah. Okay then. So we'll end the discussion there and go over to table one. We've got Stannis, 1000th Lord Commander, our remaining Baratheon player, against Furioku, our Free Folk player. Carlo, your discussion, prediction, ideas? Go on, speak your mind.
Great matchup. I'm really happy that these two got paired together because it guarantees that we don't have a Stark mirror in the final.
Hmm.
I'm very pleased about that part.
Yep.
I'm interested in the matchup itself. I don't actually think it's a very fair matchup. So I guess we'll come on to the prediction in a second. Interestingly, when my opinion of the 4 people who are left is Furioku's got a little unlucky here because I think that Stannis and the Baratheons are the number one list and the number one faction out of the 4 to play into Fire and Blood.
Hmm.
Furioku, on the other hand, is playing Free Folk, the worst of the 4 factions into Fire and Blood. So he's got himself a tough game there. I think that out of the 4 people, the 4 factions, the 4 commanders, the 8 armies we have here, Stannis would win any matchup or would have the best chances of winning any of the matchups in Fire and Blood.
Yeah.
What we'll come to later is that in the next round in Game of Thrones, he has the worst lists.
Yes. Yeah.
So Furioku's been unlucky, and that on the flip side, probably Free Folk have the strongest Game of Thrones lists, the strongest Game of Thrones win rate. So he's unlucky that he's met Stannis in this game and not in the final or in the last game mode. And that's what's interesting about the 2-list format and factions in general. And I think is also one of the things that limits Free Folk from winning events like Masters of Westeros, which is that I think that they struggle to win Fire and Blood, particularly late in an event where everybody is a good player. I think when you play Fire and Blood with Free Folk, you are hoping that your opponent isn't good, effectively, because you're fighting an uphill battle.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I do think Fire and Blood, generally speaking, statistically from what we've collected so far, it is an abysmal matchup for the Free Folk. I've played it a couple of times myself, and I have to admit, like I've found not terrible success on it recently. Um, but generally speaking, it's like it is playing my secondary list. It's playing in a completely different way to playing the game that I would normally play. Um, and we see there, a 40% win rate. They're the highest rated faction, and as you can see by looking at game modes, above 50% on pretty much everything except Fire and Blood, and that just says it all. It's just such a bad matchup because Insignificance not as not as damaging. The marking unit side of things, I just mark a unit of raiders. So there you go, what you can do. Whereas, I'm forced to be marking things like Rose Knights or Knights of the Castle Rock if that's all you're taking, and you can just come over to me and stomp units of raiders or trappers or whatever it is that I'm running, and you'll get these extra victory points. Yeah, sure, I'm not giving any away normally, but it doesn't matter because you're getting all these bonus ones basically whenever you do anything. I think Stannis to win it, probably with his Renly list. To be honest, he could play his Axel list and we still think he would win it. But his Renly list should be the one he picks, and he will probably take the game probably fairly easily.
He absolutely will.
Yeah.
I'll stake my reputation on it.
Carlo's calling it crushing. Okay, cool. That moves us down to table 2, and it's the. I think we're kind of fed up of talking about these now. Start mirror matches.
You know what? This is more It's more interesting than others because Fire and Blood is not a great game mode for Starks either. Those dogs, they're better than Free Folk Raiders because they can't be marked. Your opponent can't choose to mark them since the update to the way Fire and Blood works. So you can't mark free units. So they're not such a hindrance in terms of being such a target. And really, you didn't invest. Even though at 3 points raiders are not an expensive investment, you didn't really even invest 3 points in them. You can sit dogs right at the back of your zone if you want and just waste their activation with them. So Starks have some advantages in that way. They can do all of that while, interestingly, as we'll see Larks has done, I really like his Brynden list into this, where he runs 4 very powerful combat units in the form of 2 units of Tully Sworn Shields and a unit of House Umber Berserkers with Brynden Tully the Blackfish in, making them Tully, and a House Tully Cavaliers. So again, we're back to this point of I don't want to mark any of those 4 units. My only other unit there, which is allowing him to still have high activation count, is Shaggy Dog, and I'm not allowed to mark Shaggy.
Yeah.
With 3 NCUs, we're at that nice high 8 activation count while having no unit that your opponent wants to mark. You mark the Tully Sworn Shields, and they aren't super scary, super dangerous, but they are incredibly hard to take that point off.
Yeah.
They are. I mean, what are you going to do about that? There is basically not a tougher unit in the game if you can avoid them being flanked. And so I think that's a very tough list to play into, and I would be very surprised if he doesn't play the Brynden list, particularly because on-field commanders also in this game mode can give out those additional VPs. I think that'll be very important. So I'm relatively convinced that what we're talking about is Brynden playing into Eddard.
Mm-hmm.
Eddard has that healing, and it is interesting as to what Larks chooses to mark. But the Eddard list runs 5 combat units, and some of them seem like easier picks. So he's got those Stormcrow Mercs with Rickon. If you mark that unit, it is not that aggressive, yet it is completely viable to kill, and it is worth so many VPs.
Four total.
Unless Ariakas can use the bait, abuse how much that is worth to draw Larks in, then I don't really see that not being a big hindrance to him.
Mm-hmm.
The second unit, not so easy. There's the Great Axes, the Berserkers, or the Tully Cavaliers, all of which I don't particularly want to have to mark. The question is does he go and mark the Great Axes, knowing that Eddard is such a key part of how an Eddard list runs that you want to make it very risky to do anything with the Great Axes? They're also not as fast as the Berserkers and the Cavaliers. So they're less likely to be oppressive and proactive with that marked unit. But
Hmm.
the second one is a tough choice, but one of them was an easy, absolute every time you're gonna mark those Stormcrow mercs. And if Ariakas then chooses to sit at the back and not use that unit, he's basically playing with a lot less points.
So yeah, I think
Mm.
that Larks has, unless Ariakas is going to pull something out the ballpark, like we saw him in the last game, he pulled uh, to be honest, a very dominant victory out because he spotted an opening and he knew how to play the matchup. Unless we see Ariakas do something similar here against Larks, yeah, I think I favour Larks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay then, so that will lead us on to, not on the game mode that we see here, but it will lead us on to the final, which we're saying is going to be Stannis versus Larks, Baratheons versus Starks. Who's going to
I'm
win?
convinced that it will be Baratheons versus Starks because I'm convinced that Stannis will win the game. It doesn't have to be Larks.
No, might be
Um,
Ariakas.
that is less sure in my mind, but obviously it will be Starks on one side, and I'm pretty convinced that it's Baratheons on the other. And as pleased as I am that Baratheons have gone all the way and proved that they can be very viable, I don't see them winning the game. I don't see Baratheons winning against Starks in Game of Thrones. He does not have in either list the board presence to cover enough objectives in the way that the Starks can. The Starks will bring a huge activation advantage. No matter what list we talk about, there will be activation advantage. There will be dogs to place on objectives for free. They the Starks will have the Baratheons, even with Melisandre, won't have any real opportunity to reach out and destroy those dogs, which are sat there doing a lot of work. And the Starks will get to the central objective first.
Yeah.
And the Baratheons will struggle to apply their pressure up the board while also controlling objectives. For me, the Stark player wants to place those objectives as close to deployment zones as possible because he doesn't want it to become a melee in the middle. He wants it to be a choice of either control objectives or fight in the middle, which he has the opportunities to do with the dogs. He can apply almost his entire strength to the central battle while still controlling objectives close to his own deployment zone. Whereas the Baratheon player, Stannis, he needs to place objectives basically on the center line so that it becomes a melee for 3 objectives in the center and 1 objective close to each deployment zone. Which brings me to a thought. If Stannis is so convinced that me convincing, if I was so convinced as the Baratheon player that I was going to lose the match, if that happened, I might be tempted to stack the objectives on one side of the board. And by doing so, risk a 50-50 dice roll of getting to choose deployment zone. And if I win the side that I want, then now I say, oh, well, funnily enough, I control all the objectives and you have to come to me.
Yeah. I mean, that was one thing I was thinking about. Um, as an alternative as well, though, how about a line deployment of objectives? So if we see one objective come down in the middle of the table, obviously, then we see an objective come down a side um, against the kind of like table edge, if you like, or the deployment zone. You could almost deploy them in a line across the field. Yeah, a diagonal line from one deployment zone to the other. And Stannis can therefore create a battle line. And he's not going to be advancing onto, he's actually going to be advancing up the objectives. So he can be a little bit more risky. He doesn't have to leave necessarily units behind, and he can just march down the line knowing that as long as he keeps plodding away down the line and mincing whatever stands in his way down that line of advance, if he can do that, then he eventually will kill all of the Starks, or there will no longer be objectives left for the Starks to control. So he effectively creates a very linear path for him to go, this is what I'm walking down, and everything in my way is going to die, and I'm going to try and kill it as quick as I can. That's hard because I don't think it's necessarily a viable option, because I don't think he can kill them fast enough. But it definitely brings a new dynamic to the game, especially if he can then prevent the Starks from getting behind him.
I don't see it going any way other than a Stark win because of a Baratheon versus Stark final matchup. Free Folk have a real chance, funnily enough, but I don't think they can get through Baratheons to get there.
Right, guys, so that'll lead us to the end of our predictions. We'll be back next week with another roundup video, and obviously we'll have to re-predict the top table if we got it all wrong. We'll also look at, who's in contention for second place, and we maybe talk about that as well. Big shout out to the sponsors, of course. Obviously, we've got NRG as the main group running it, and Song of Ice and Fire Stats. But a huge shout out to West Coast Bannerman, and of course Mythica Studios. We've also got on board on the table gaming, and Small Council Radio. So all of these guys putting stuff in towards the tournament. A huge shout out to Mythica Studios as well, because Mythicus have put so much time and effort, and especially money in terms of prizes and things towards the tournament, and also doing a huge amount out there while the lockdown. They've become a huge provider of boxes and things kind of across the US and UK, I believe, as well, and across the world during this lockdown period. So a huge shout out to them. And Carlo, I think you were going to say something about that?
Yeah, well, I think some people might have seen that something is coming, and it's just to say that Mythicos have really been the biggest part of that, and I've worked with Mythicos in the past, and they've really helped up everything that I've been doing as a content creator, and so big thanks to Nick at Mythicos for everything that's getting done there. So if you see good stuff, it's probably because of them, but Nick won't always put his name to it.
Yeah. And we'll kind of leave off, I guess, with the final thing being obviously that we really hope that everyone's enjoying the tournament, enjoying the videos, enjoying the stats breakdown. Links to all of the various Facebook and all of that stuff is going to be in the description down below. And we'll be back next week for the final one, the final chat. We'll do some final roundups. And yeah. So you guys take it easy, okay?